The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun, Sudhaman, and I'm joined by my colleague in London, Maja Pawinska. Sims is back from holiday. Maja, welcome back.
Thanks, Arun. Good to be back.
It's great to have you back. You've missed a lot, I guess.
Yeah, well, you always think popping off for a couple of weeks in August, it's all going to be quiet, but it seems to have all kicked off while I was sunning myself. So yeah, I've been catching up.
Things are kicking off in the industry.
They are. It's been busy. It's been a busy couple of weeks. Lots to talk about.
It's been a busy summer, I feel. It's become one of those old chestnuts that you say, oh, it's going to slow down in the summer. And then it never really seems to slow down as much as you think it might.
Yes, no, this is true.
This summer has been particularly busy. So maybe we'll talk through some of those things.
Yeah, let's do that. So where should we start? Where should we start? Let's start with what's going on at some of the big agencies. There's a lot of moves around, a lot of big stuff happening. Should we start with Edelman? What's been going on there?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I think people who observe the industry will not be massively surprised whenever there's senior departures from Edelman or big name hires. We have written about this before. Richard Edelman has, he's gone on the record with us as saying that he likes organized chaos. There's always a kind of sort of feeling of that, that a certain level of turbulence it's almost required to drive that agency forward. And, it has been probably the best performing PR agency of the last 15 years. But yeah, some big departures recently. I think last week we reported that global brand chair Mark Renshaw had stepped down. I think that was a bit of a surprise. He was one of the big flagship hires from the ad industry, Leo Burnett veteran. Then it emerged that John Clinton had left the agency at the end of June. And that, I think, was, I don't know, in some respects, that was even more surprising because John was, he was one of the first hires from Adland, and he was seen as one of the people that had really helped to kind of usher in this shift at Edelman, towards, I guess, what you describe as, upstream creative strategy. So two interesting departures. And I guess you probably have to put it against the backdrop at Edelman of slower growth over the last couple of years. This is an agency that we had, I used to compare Edelman to the Chinese economy, where, you could bank on it growing 8 to 12% a year.
Yeah.
Much like the Chinese economy, that's no longer the case.
Well, I guess there's a different slant between organised chaos and that kind of shifting energy when times are good, and when times are slowed down, it kind of takes on a different colour, I guess. So you look
Absolutely.
at it differently. It's like, is this part of their recipe for success as it has been in the past, or is this the result of things slowing down? It feels like something's a bit different this year for Edelman.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it as a high-risk strategy. But, I would say I'd applaud them to an extent for being willing to take those kinds of risks. Richard Edelman has been, has been very vocal about how they have attempted to make this transformation towards an agency that can do the full range of marketing communication services, hiring 600 creatives and planners, but that can throw up some real challenges, some real cultural challenges as well. And we've asked Richard this question before: is the slower growth, is that a result of the changes that have been made, or is it down to more macro economic issues? Is it down to market forces? Richard, of course, has said it's down to market forces. He doesn't, of course, understandably doesn't want to suggest that their strategy is the reason for it. But that question, I think, is still one that's worth asking.
Yeah, I think there's a big it's part of a big conversation, isn't it? Whether it's market forces or not, the whole agency model and the search for the perfect big agency model is just rumbling on, and it's like there's always going to be churn at a senior level, and we've got all the lots of ex-Burson people floating around post Burson Cohn and Wolfe sorting out its leadership globally now, as we've announced. But there's another point, which is that to your cultural point, bringing in all the creatives and planners, does that work? Doesn't it work? Who goes? Who stays? It's like we're in a period of all the big agencies, and to a certain extent some of the mid-sizes are wrestling with what a successful, profitable agency looks like, and it feels like everything's in a big state of flux at the moment. I'm not sure anyone's really even got close to working out what the right answer is yet.
Yeah, I think that is correct. I mean, the word transformation is bandied around a lot. I think what we're seeing is agencies grappling with that. I mean, the ultimate goal here, I guess, is that these agencies, especially at the bigger end of the spectrum, want to compete for these marketing budgets, which are typically much bigger than communications budgets. And to do that, I think they've correctly identified that they need to be able to provide much more than the kind of earned media services that have driven them. But there's more to it than just the skills. There's being able to have there's the relationships with CMOs. There's being able to speak the right language in the right places. And I think many of the agencies are still grappling with that challenge. I think Edelman, unsurprisingly, has been the most advanced in its efforts to make that leap because, as an independent agency, it's always been able to invest more than its publicly held peers. It did that to really successful effect when it came to digital investment, probably around a decade ago. And I think it's tried to replicate that formula here when it comes to hiring creators and planners. Understandably, I think it probably thought, okay, we can use the same formula and move out ahead of our rivals. But it hasn't been, at least from the outside, it doesn't seem to have been as smooth a ride as its kind of as its extension into digital capabilities was all those years ago. No,
and it'll be interesting to see how it pans out, that whole kind of the understanding of the need for creatives and planners and how you go about bringing them into company. It'll be interesting to see how, and we've seen in the last couple of weeks, Weber Shandwick buying that lot, David Schneider's big social creative agency, BCW buying digital creative agency HZ, so bolting on 200 creatives to the company. It'll be very interesting to see how, whether that does become enmeshed and truly part of the, I know this is a terrible phrase, it's always bandied around, the kind of the DNA of the agency, whether it truly does become more than earned in all three cases, or whether that is always going to be a little bit of a clash of cultures, whether it's ever possible to make a PR agency into much more than a PR agency, whether we should be trying to do that. So I think over the next year or so, or two, or maybe even longer than that, whether that works as a way of getting those marketing budgets, I think is massively up for debate at the moment. I hope it does. Yeah. I really hope it does. I hope that's part of the answer. But it'll be interesting to see, because these are big investments, and will they pay off?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point you mentioned, the clash of cultures, and I think that's the thing that agencies often underestimate. And we see that time and again. And of course, the bigger the agency, the harder the cultural challenges. Because, I think it's easier when you have a 20-person agency to make a fundamental change than it is with a 2,000-person agency.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that the cultural challenge is really hard. I mean, changing DNA is very hard. From a biological standpoint,
absolutely.
It's very hard.
it's almost impossible, in fact.
Nothing to suggest it will be easier for agencies. And the other thing I'd say on that is I still feel like we have not seen any really tangible examples of an agency really cornering a marketing budget and being handed the keys to brand building. I mean, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but
no, I don't think we have.
I still think it's more aspirational than real.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It does feel like we're kind of getting closer, but it doesn't feel like the industry is anywhere there yet. I mean, I don't know how much of it I don't know how much of this PR believes. It's like it does feel a bit like we're trying this approach now. But it's interesting times, as they say.
I mean, are we any closer? That's the question, really. No one wants to admit that after all these investments, we're not.
Yeah. Well, do you know what? One of the things that came up a lot in the responses from our Influence 100 survey and research is, it's a pretty unique thing. It's pretty niche. I can't qualify unique, obviously. It's a unique thing in that we have, conversations with 100 of the leading CMOs and CCOs for the biggest brands around the world. And one of the things that came back in a lot of their responses to our survey, which goes into quite a lot of depth about what they're thinking and feeling about PR agencies. And one of the things that came up we asked the first time this year, what frustrates you about this industry and what frustrates you about the agencies you're working with? And the lack of confidence came up time and again, which I wasn't particularly surprised by, but it's been noted by the clients that PR doesn't necessarily have that self-confidence in its own ability. So it's almost, that it's talking the talk, but it's like, how much do you believe that you're clients are like horses, aren't they? They can smell when you're not really feeling it.
It's been an issue. I mean, for as long as I've been covering this industry, I'm sure for as long as you've been covering this industry as well, this idea that public relations people just don't have the swagger that you see from people in advertising.
That's such a good word.
So yeah, but it is true. And I can kind of understand where it comes from, because when you're dealing with, let's say, high-level media relations, it often doesn't pay to have that kind of swagger. Sometimes, it is more useful to have a level of humility, and that kind of plays better in that arena.
Yeah. I mean, otherwise you get.
I can understand it, but as someone, I just remember when I covered advertising. If you were to say to an ad agency, "Can you do something?" they would always just say yes, and just figure out a price. I mean, whereas I always feel like with PR agencies, they'll have like there'll be a lot of soul searching will go on, and then maybe they'll come back and say no. I mean, it's a totally different attitude.
It is a different attitude, and I think a lot. I don't think that's as you said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of a double-edged sword, because the PR and earns deals with stuff that is so much more complex and layered and nuanced than paid, for the most part. That there's almost quite a lot of an intellectual exercise goes on in working out how to approach a brief and how to do things. It's it's a very much more of a 360 look that the best practitioners in this industry can provide, which is why their counsel is so valuable.
Up the Thames, upstream or downstream?
It's not all about sailing something up the Thames. We know this.
Yeah, it's always downstream as well. Anyway.
It's always downstream. Anyway, it's me trying to big up the PR industry as being full of creative intellectuals.
But you're right. I'm being flippant, but you are right. You are right. You're making a very good point, I think, which is that there are good reasons why you don't, that level of brashness is not necessarily inculcated into the PR industry. But I guess sometimes it's a weakness.
Yeah, I think so too. Sometimes it's a weakness, and sometimes it's a strength, and that's something that is probably never going to change, no matter how many creatives and planners you bolt onto your core operation.
Yeah, I mean, you talk to a lot of creatives and planners who are in the industry. So do I. I always feel there's a level of discontent amongst their ranks. Like they feel like they're not really understood. They're kind of refugees from a different planetary system. Yeah.
I've seen this a lot, actually, that the creative spirit of somebody who's been brought in from more of an ad creative background coming into a PR agency, it is literally like moving to a different country. The language is different, the environment's different, the goals are different, the timescales are different. And actually, creative is not always the solution to a comms or reputational or business issue. It isn't always creative. So it's not ever going to be, just because you've got a massive data planning and creative department doesn't necessarily mean that's always going to be the solution. And I think there's a danger that because it's such a big investment, everything then goes like, let's get the creatives in. Sometimes it's not about the creative. Sometimes it is about something a little bit more subtle than that.
Yeah. And I still feel like a lot of times the creatives are there for business development in many of the cases, and defining their role, actually kind of really formalizing it across everything an agency does, probably still an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
Compared to an ad agency structure where it's really clear, everything revolves around the creative. So it is like a different country, a different planet. But we hope, I guess, to see progress. So and you mentioned Burson Cohn and Wolfe. I guess that's probably that's the biggest story of the year. That continues to rumble on. The acquisition of HZ, departures, which not unexpected at all. I think everyone knew once Cohn and Wolfe took over Burson Marsteller that a number of people from the Burson side would leave, and that has transpired. We've seen senior people in North America, in Europe, and in Asia leave. I don't think it's any huge surprise. I think Burson Cohn and Wolfe CEO Donna Imperato is, finalizing her global leadership team. Seems to be pretty much in place now.
Yeah.
Mergers are not without pain, and this is, of course, the biggest merger we've seen in the PR industry. So there will be some pain, but it's going to be a while before we can say with any measure of certainty how successful this effort has been.
Oh gosh, this is going to take ages. I mean, EMEA President Scott Wilson is still finalising the last couple of country leadership posts, and to his point, when I spoke to him in depth about how the whole EMEA structure was going to pan out, the biggest challenge there is there's quite a lot of Burson people in market leadership positions. So, that's of note. So it's not like Cohn and Wolfe Cohn and Wolfe people have just been plugged in everywhere across Europe in particular.
Yeah.
But
Europe, Middle East,
yes, exactly. But to Scott's point, and going back to our thing about culture and DNA, the biggest challenge is not just there's a big challenge in merging two offices in a territory where there's been, or a region or an area where there's been a Burson office and a Cohn and Wolfe office. That's a big challenge. But he said actually a bigger challenge is what does BCW mean where there was only a Burson Marsteller office? How do you create a BCW culture where you're not actually merging two companies? So it's kind of less tangible on the ground that something's changed. So, maybe not a lot has changed in a particular market. So how do you turn that from being Burson Marsteller to BCW when you haven't got that, the whole load of Cohn and Wolfe people, coming into your office? So I think that's going to be, just purely on the cultural point. I think that's going to be very interesting to see how successful that is. That BCW has its own identity. I mean, it's the whole rollout of a new social and digital presence, identity, logo, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we still haven't seen any of that, really.
Well, that's a good couple of months away still, I reckon. And until that happens, and then we're looking at, practically a year since the announcement, and it's just been, year one has just been kind of getting ducks in a row, effectively. So it won't be until... It won't be until, end of 2019 that we'll have any idea of whether this has worked or not.
Yeah, but I think that kind of plays to Donna's strengths as well in a way, because we know, one thing we know is that Donna's just, she's very good at growing agency businesses.
Absolutely.
And given that the P&Ls are going to be kept separate this year, and then they'll combine next year, I'd be surprised if there isn't significant growth in 2019. And, even just looking at this year, it's moving quickly. There's definitely no sense that things are being allowed to drift there. So
no, and I think clients are interested as well. From what I gather, there's quite a lot of requests for the new BCW to be involved in very big pitches globally at the moment. The clients are interested in what the combined entity has got to offer. So I think they're going to pick up. That the old non-disclosure agreements are a pain for agencies and for us, because it's not always possible to find out who's doing what, as it was in the olden days. But I'd be very surprised if we don't have some quite big announcements in terms of new client wins globally over the next few months as well.
Okay. Well, keep us posted.
I will do when my moles provide the information.
Excellent. So what else is going on?
Racepoint, but there's stuff going on there. Larry Webber's back at the helm. Are they cutting? Aren't they cutting? Yeah. Mark Jackson's out in China. It's like there's a lot going on there. What do you think's the situation?
It's an interesting one. Racepoint is it's an agency that maybe isn't as well known as some of the ones we've talked about. Quite a tech-focused business, merged with a sister agency a few years ago, a digital firm, which I think took it up to around 30, at least 30 million in revenue. But global CEO Peter Prodromou, who'd been with the firm for a long time, departed at the beginning of summer, and Larry Webber has stepped back in as CEO. I don't know if that's a long-term thing. I'd be surprised if they didn't find if they didn't find another CEO, because I think Larry he's got the holding group to look after. They have private equity investment as well, so I suspect there are some questions there about what the long-term goals for Racepoint and for its owner. I think it's W2 Group, what the long-term goals are. I think whenever the CEO leaves, you expect a measure of change, and that may be what's happened with Mark Jackson in Greater China. Racepoint has a strong relationship with Huawei in this part of the world. So I think they'll be very keen to manage that and ensure there's no disruption there. But I guess it probably speaks to broadly to these changes that we're seeing across the industry. That Racepoint is an agency that started life as a sort of classic tech PR shop, has merged with digital, broadened its offering, broadened its global footprint, and as it's kind of seeking that kind of accelerated growth, has perhaps run into some challenges on the way.
Yeah, again, that's going to be another one to watch over the next 6 to 12 months, isn't it? And I totally agree with you. I'd be very surprised if Larry Webber is assuming that he's back there for the long term. It feels like he's there to kind of steady the ship, set it back on course, find somebody else. Presumably, it's possibly somebody from ex-Burson or Edelman who's floating around in the market at the moment. To steer it. It's like a roundabout, isn't it? This industry, and set it back on course, because they've got a good offer clearly, and it's just sort of maybe it's just gone astray a little bit.
Yeah, I mean it's had a tough time as well in the US. Don't know if you're familiar, but it had this fraud issue where it's I think a senior accountant, maybe the chief financial officer, had embezzled, I think, millions of dollars from Racepoint, and actually facing federal charges, which is, that's a really tough one, and not something you can really foresee or plan for, and for an agency of that size as well, quite a significant hit. So something else it's had to handle. But yeah, like you said, there are plenty of capable people out there on the market.
Yeah.
So we shall watch that one closely.
And what else have we got to talk about? H&K and Ogilvy have completed their North Asian consolidation or integration, or whatever they're calling it, this week. After Korea has come after Japan.
Don't call it a merger.
It's not a merger. They're definitely not merging. They're consolidating and integrating.
Don't call it a merger. It is a merger. Don't call it a merger.
Japan and now North Asia. And we've got the quote at the end of the story there that there are no immediate plans to do this elsewhere, which obviously means that it's probably going to happen elsewhere in the not too distant.
Within 2 weeks it will happen.
That's probably famous last words, isn't it? No immediate plans.
Same with Omnicom PR Group. It's always the classic response. We are not considering this for any other markets. David Gallagher's going to be on the phone to us after this podcast, taking issue. No, I think. I think that actually is honest when people say that. But of course, things change very quickly in this industry, and I think what we're seeing is the pressure on publicly listed groups, and so they are rationalizing their operations, particularly in markets where growth has been difficult to come by, and making decisions that they don't need as many agency brands in certain markets. So obviously we saw this with Omnicom PR Group in Europe, merging 3 agencies in 4 different markets.
Yeah,
we saw it with Omnicom PR Group in Singapore. We saw it with H&K and Ogilvy in, I think, Denmark. And now, as of this year, we've seen it with H&K and Ogilvy in Japan and Korea. I guess the only thing surprising here is that Japan and Korea are both pretty big markets, especially Japan, of course, which remains the world's second or third biggest economy, depending on how you look at it. And it seems like a strange place for agencies to be, effectively deciding that they need to reduce their presence rather than expand it. But Japan is quite a unique market. It has always been quite difficult for international agencies. There's only a handful of agencies, whether that's advertising or PR or digital or media, who have succeeded in Japan. And so I suspect it's because of those reasons, those kind of unique local conditions, that we're seeing H&K and Ogilvy make that decision. So in Japan, H&K has kind of moved into Ogilvy, and the opposite has happened in Korea, where Ogilvy has basically moved into H&K. I suppose the big question is where it would happen next.
Yes, I think so. I mean, the Asian market a lot better than I do, but I just think we're going to see more and more of this consolidation of brands. It's like the market in. I mean, you look at London, where I'm based, and the market's really saturated.
I know.
So I don't know where it's going to happen next, but I don't think the Korea is not the last time we're going to see a couple of Omnicom PR.
No, it's not, and it's not like you have kind of noted. It's not just Asia, right? There are many parts of the world, I think, where you could throw a dart against a world map and maybe come up with 3 WPP PR firms or 3 Omnicom PR firms, and ask yourself the question: are all of those brands necessary in that market?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know how I don't know how you differentiate your offer now within the big holding company groups. What makes what is the spirit and the purpose of one brand against another, that basically offering more or less the same thing? Why would you go as a client with one and not the other? And to what extent are they already competing or working together? It's kind of there's a lot more to come out in the wash, I think, with the big holding groups and their PR brands.
Yeah, that question, I think, is one that holding groups don't like to consider too much, because when you think about it, that's an existential question. What really does distinguish one agency from another, especially at that end of the industry?
Yeah.
They have different names, but I think a lot of the times it really does come down to who's the specific person running an account.
Yeah, it's all down to the relationships in the end. I mean, it's this is a people business. It's
but if
all
that
down
person
to those
changes agency, does it really matter? I mean, it's almost like flags of convenience at this point. But so the net effect is, yes, I think we're going to see more consolidation in some of these markets. I mean, I can think of a number of markets in Asia where I suspect it's being considered actively, and the pressure, the financial pressure that holding groups are under in terms of the markets, is only, I think, going to hasten this process.
Yeah, I think you're right, but it's interesting that it's not just happening in markets where the economy is struggling. The fact that it's happening in, to your point, in Japan as well indicates that it's something bigger than just local pressure.
Yeah, I just wondered when you mentioned the UK. It's an interesting one, because every agency worth its salt has a UK operation, and yet we know that it's an oversaturated market, that there's a lot of price competition, and that there are probably a few agencies at least that don't necessarily need to be there, or at least they don't need to be there kind of on the scale that they currently are there.
Well, be interesting to see if Brexit does happen. It'll be interesting to see if there's any global agencies. That's a whole other conversation, obviously, but if that does happen, I'm just injecting if there are not being partisan in any way, but if it does happen next March, it'll be very interesting to see whether it is still worth being in London, or whether Frankfurt or Dublin or Paris make more sense as a European hub. I don't know.
You can be partisan, by the way. That's perfectly acceptable. We welcome partisan views.
I think the PR industry as a whole is very much hoping that it doesn't happen, because it's not going to add. It's just going to cause chaos. But if it does, I think there'll be questions about whether London is a still the most desirable and valid hub for an EMEA. I mean, EMEA only exists in the minds of global companies. Obviously, it's such a broad region. It's like there's another existential question: what is EMEA? But
what is EMEA?
What is EMEA? It does not exist. But as the EMEA hub is often London for global brands and agencies, and whether that will remain the case, and if if there's big brands thinking about whether they're going to still need a UK HQ, then their agencies of all colours and denominations will also have to start, wondering the same thing. But we'll see. That's pure speculation, but we'll just have to see.
Yeah, well, I would welcome it actually. I think. I'm a huge fan of the London PR industry, but I've often thought that EMEA has always kind of revolved a little bit too much around London. And if that can be decentralised, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing.
No, I don't either. I think it would be a very good thing. Much as London is brilliant, and some of the best agencies in the world, particularly the smaller mid-sizes, are based here. But for the big global groups, it may not continue to make sense for London to be the centre of the universe. So we'll see. Talking about partisan, shall we have a chat about the PRSA?
Yeah, I don't have much time. I've only got a couple of minutes.
Okay,
which may not be enough time to do this epic saga.
Everyone go and read Diana's analysis and Paul's opinion piece.
Diana's magnum opus, in which she plunged herself into the maelstrom of trade association politics. And I have nothing but admiration for her for taking on an assignment that I think none of us was keen to take on. And then Paul, of course, adding his own unique spin to what had happened there. I definitely would urge everyone to read this story. Kind of an instructive fable about where we are, 2018. I think that PRSA being criticised by its members for perhaps taking on a political point of view. Personally, I felt there was nothing there that warranted criticism. Yeah, I'll probably get criticised for saying that, but I'm really not that bothered, to be honest with you. But yeah, that's kind of where we are today. I think just this whole idea of backing the truth is a tricky one.
Yeah, it is, and the polarisation as well. There's no middle ground anymore. There's no discussion or debate. It's kind of dead in the political arena, isn't it? So it's like my way or the highway, black or white. It's very disheartening, I think, and it's not good for discourse generally in social and political discourse that you can't hold both two competing opinions in both hands anymore, which is you've got to come down hard on one side or another. And brands are having the same thing. CEOs just used to keep their mouth shut, and now they've got to have a view on stuff that is nothing to do with their core operations, and that's it's another layer of pressure that you have to kind of formulate an opinion and stick to it. You can't just stay silent anymore, which is
and I think that's tricky for trade associations. I actually think brands are getting to grips with that quite well for the most part. But I think trade associations are always hamstrung because they've always operated on this business of making decisions by committee and by consensus, and often that means making the least offensive decision, right?
Yes.
The one that's acceptable to the broadest range of people. And that's really difficult now because I just don't think you can make a decision that's acceptable to everyone.
No. And sometimes...
if that's the case, then I think rather than trying to please everyone, just ensure you're on the side of what's right rather than what's convenient.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really important for trade associations, and the PRCA are very good at this as well, of taking a view. I think it's important they take a view and are prepared to kind of justify that view based on bigger picture stuff than just trying to please everybody, because then everything gets watered down and nobody knows what the organisation stands for.
Yeah, and I think, as Paul said in his piece, it's about leadership, right?
Yeah.
That's what leadership looks like. And I don't want to criticise the PRSA because I think it is actually really difficult for them, because these boards and so on, they're not really formulated to deliver that kind of leadership. They're set up to deliver consensus.
Yes.
and I think it's quite difficult. I think the PRCA is quite a unique beast in that respect, in that they have accepted that the board will lead, and I think they realised that was what was required, a decade or so ago when Francis Ingham took charge, and it's been really successful for them. But for other trade groups, I think it's still a journey, as they say.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Well, Maja, great to have you back.
Great to be back.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers.